The Stagecoach lurched to a violent halt outside the Dusty Rose saloon, and Thomas Xavier knew before the door even opened that his carefully ordered life in Jerome Junction was about to change forever. It was August of 1883, and the Arizona heat had turned the main street into something resembling the devil's frying pan. Thomas had been leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, his worn hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, when the Wells Fargo coach came barreling down the rutted road faster than any driver with good sense would have managed. Dust billowed up in angry clouds, coating everything within 20 feet in a fine layer of grit. The horses snorted and stamped, their flanks dark with sweat and foam gathering at their bits. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, stepping forward instinctively as the driver, old Pete Morrison, scrambled down from his perch with unusual urgency. "Got a problem, Tom," Pete said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Lady inside. Mail order bride for some rancher up north, but she's in a bad way. Been shaking since we left Prescott. Can't seem to stop. Thought maybe you could help, seeing as you got that way about you that calms folks down." Thomas frowned. He was just a ranch hand, albeit one with a reputation for being good with skittish horses and nervous cattle. He had no business dealing with a woman, especially not someone else's intended bride. But Pete was already opening the Stagecoach door, and Thomas caught his first glimpse of her. She sat pressed into the far corner of the coach, her traveling dress wrinkled and dusty, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. But it was the trembling that caught his attention. Her entire body shook with fine, constant tremors, like an aspen leaf in a strong wind. Her face was pale beneath the grime of travel, her lips pressed together in a thin line, and her eyes held a kind of desperate fear that made Thomas's chest tighten. "Miss," he said softly, the way he might speak to a frightened mare. "I'm Thomas Xavier. Folks call me Tom. You're safe here in Jerome Junction. Can you step down from the coach?" Her eyes darted to him, wide and green as new grass after rain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the shaking intensified, and Thomas saw her eyes begin to roll back. He moved without thinking, climbing into the coach and catching her just as she started to slump sideways. Her skin was clammy against his hands, and the trembling ran through her like an electrical current. "Pete, get Doc Harrison," Thomas ordered, but his voice remained gentle as he spoke to the woman. "Miss, I need you to stay with me. Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and a small sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob. "That's good," Thomas said, even though he had no idea if it was good or not. He just knew he needed to keep her conscious and keep her calm. "I'm going to help you out of this coach and get you somewhere cooler. The heat in here could bake bread." He gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. As he lifted her from the coach, her shaking seemed to worsen, and she made that sound again, that desperate little gasp. "Breathe," Thomas said, holding her carefully as he stepped down into the street. A small crowd had begun to gather, curious faces peering from doorways and windows. "Just breathe with me, miss. In and out, nice and slow." He demonstrated, taking a long, deliberate breath and letting it out slowly. Her green eyes fixed on his face, and he saw her trying to match his rhythm, but the trembling made it difficult. "That's it," he encouraged, carrying her toward the saloon. The owner, a stern woman named Margaret who ran the cleanest establishment in town, was already holding the door open. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Follow my breathing." Thomas carried her through the saloon's main room, past the bar and the card tables, toward the back where Margaret kept a few rooms for travelers. The dimness inside was a relief after the brutal sunshine, and the temperature was marginally cooler. Put her in room 3, Margaret said briskly. I'll get water and cloths. Pete's gone for the doctor. Thomas nodded, climbing the narrow stairs with his burden. The woman in his arms had stopped trying to speak, but her eyes never left his face, and he could feel her attempting to match his breathing pattern. The shaking continued, relentless and frightening. Room 3 was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a washstand in the corner. Thomas laid her down gently, but when he tried to step back, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she managed to gasp, the word coming out broken and desperate. "Please don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas promised, settling himself on the edge of the bed. Her hand remained clamped around his wrist, her fingers cold despite the heat. "I'm right here." "Can you tell me your name?" Jane, she stammered, the word fighting its way past the tremors. "Jane Wilson." "Jane," Thomas repeated, letting his voice carry all the calmness he could muster. "That's a good name. Strong name, Jane. I need you to keep breathing with me. Can you do that?" She nodded, or tried to, the movement jerky and uncontrolled. Thomas shifted position so he could take her hand properly, wrapping his work-roughened fingers around her delicate ones. "Feel my hand," he asked. "It's steady. Rock steady. I want you to focus on that. Focus on how still my hand is, and let that stillness move up your arm." It was something he had done once with a horse that had gotten tangled in barbed wire, trapped and panicking. He had held the animal's head, kept his own body perfectly still, and let the horse absorb that calmness through touch. He had no idea if it would work with a person, but he was willing to try anything to ease the fear he saw in Jane Wilson's eyes. "That's good," he murmured as her grip loosened slightly. "Keep breathing, in and out. You're safe, Jane. Whatever happened, whatever scared you, you're safe now." Margaret appeared with a pitcher of water and clean cloths, setting them on the washstand without a word. She gave Thomas a meaningful look before slipping back out, closing the door softly behind her. "I'm going to put a cool cloth on your forehead," Thomas said, reluctantly releasing her hand long enough to wet one of the cloths. "It might help with the heat." Jane made a small sound of protest when he let go, but he was back in seconds, settling beside her again and pressing the damp cloth gently to her temples. Her eyes closed, and he watched the trembling begin to ease just slightly, just enough to give him hope. "There you go," he said softly. "Just keep breathing. Nice and slow. You've been traveling in this heat for how long?" 3 days, Jane whispered, her voice thin and strained. "Stage stops every night, but the shaking started this morning, and I couldn't make it stop." "You're probably exhausted," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and soothing. "Heat exhaustion, fear, rough travel, all combined. Your body's just overwhelmed." "I thought I was dying," she admitted, and a single tear slid from the corner of her eye down into her hair. "I thought I would die in that coach, and nobody would care, and he would just order another bride like I was a piece of furniture that got broken in shipping." Thomas felt anger flare in his chest at her words, at the resignation in her voice. "Who are you supposed to be marrying?" "Richard Thornton," Jane said, and Thomas recognized the name. Thornton owned a large ranch about 2 days' ride north near Prescott. He was older, probably 50 if he was a day, and Thomas had heard he had a cold way about him. "I'm from Philadelphia. My father died last year, left debts. My uncle arranged the marriage, said it was the only way to keep the family from disgrace." "So you're traveling across the country to marry a man you've never met," Thomas said quietly. "I've seen his photograph," Jane said, opening her eyes to look at him. The trembling had eased to occasional shudders now, her breathing more regular. "He looked stern. His letters were brief, but I thought I could manage. I thought I could be brave. And then this morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't turn back anymore, and my hands started shaking, and then my arms, and then everything, and I couldn't stop. Thomas wrung out the cloth and folded it across her forehead again. You've been holding yourself together for a long time, haven't you? Holding in all that fear and grief, Jane nodded, another tear escaping. I had to be strong for my mother and sisters, had to pretend I was happy about the marriage. Had to smile and pack my trunks and say goodbye like I was going on an adventure instead of selling myself to save their reputations. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Thomas said, and he meant it. To do something that terrifies you for people you love, that's true courage. I don't feel brave, Jane whispered. I feel like a coward, shaking and falling apart when I need to be strong. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Thomas told her, remembering something his father had said before he died. It's being scared and doing it anyway. And your body's just telling you what your mind has been trying to ignore. You're terrified, and you have every right to be. They sat in silence for a moment, Thomas holding her hand, Jane's breathing gradually steadying. The shaking hadn't stopped entirely, but it had diminished enough that she no longer looked like she might come apart at the seams. "Who are you?" Jane asked finally. "Not just your name. Who are you really?" "Nobody special," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Just a ranch hand. I work for the Sullivan Spread about 5 miles outside town. Been doing it since I was 18 after my folks died of fever. I'm 26 now, been saving up to buy my own land someday." "You have kind eyes," Jane said softly, "and gentle hands. I noticed that even through the panic." Thomas felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the Arizona summer. "I work with horses mostly. You learn to be gentle or you don't get anywhere with them." "Am I like a horse to you?" Jane asked, but there was no offense in her voice, only curiosity. "A little," Thomas admitted. "When something's scared, whether it's a horse or a person, they need the same things. Patience, calmness, someone steady to hold on to, someone who won't add to their fear." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Doc Harrison bustled in, his medical bag in hand. He was a portly man in his 60s with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose. "Let me have a look at you, young lady," he said briskly, but not unkindly. Thomas moved to stand, but Jane's grip on his hand tightened. "Stay," she said, her eyes pleading. "Please." Thomas looked at the doctor, who nodded. "Might help keep her calm. You seem to have a talent for it, Tom." Doc Harrison conducted his examination while Thomas held Jane's hand, checking her pulse, listening to her heart, looking at her eyes and tongue. Finally, he sat back and cleaned his spectacles. "Heat exhaustion, nervous exhaustion, and from what I can gather, a full-blown panic attack," he pronounced. "Nothing that rest, cool water, and good food won't cure, but I'd recommend at least 2 days of bed rest before any more travel." "I'm supposed to be in Prescott tomorrow," Jane protested weakly. "Mr. Thornton is expecting me." "Mr. Thornton can wait," Doc Harrison said firmly. "You're in no condition to travel. I'll send him a telegram explaining the situation." He pulled a small bottle from his bag. "This is laudanum. Small doses to help you sleep and calm the nerves. Margaret will make sure you're looked after." After the doctor left with instructions for Margaret, Thomas found himself still sitting beside Jane's bed, still holding her hand. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, painting everything in gold. "You should go," Jane said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You must have work to do." "Probably," Thomas agreed. "But I told you I wouldn't leave, and I keep my promises, even to a stranger." "Especially to a stranger who needs help." Jane studied his face for a long moment. "Tell me about Jerome Junction," she said finally. "Tell me something good about this place." Thomas smiled. "Well, despite the name, there's no actual junction here. The town was named after a surveyor's joke that nobody bothered to correct. We've got about 300 people, give or take, most of them decent folks trying to make a living. There's copper mining in the hills, which brings in enough money to keep the town alive. The saloon serves the best steak you'll find within 50 miles, and Margaret runs it with an iron fist that keeps the rowdiness to a minimum. "What else?" Jane asked, and Thomas realized she was using his voice as an anchor, something to focus on besides her fear. "There's a schoolhouse, brand new, built just last year. A proper church with a bell that rings every Sunday. A general store run by the Chen family, immigrants from China who came here to work the railroad and stayed for the mining. They're good people, fair traders. And there's the land itself." Thomas's voice softened as he spoke about the land. "It's harsh country, no denying that. Hot as hell in summer, cold enough to freeze in winter. But when the sun rises over the red rocks, or when the rare rain comes and everything blooms, there's nowhere more beautiful on God's earth. It's the kind of place that tests you, but if you can survive it, it changes you, makes you stronger." "You love it here?" Jane asked. "I do," Thomas said simply. "It's home, the only real home I've had since my parents died." "I don't have a home anymore," Jane said quietly. "Philadelphia stopped feeling like home after Papa died, and I don't know if anywhere will feel like home again." "Home isn't always a place," Thomas said. "Sometimes it's a feeling, sometimes it's people." Margaret brought up a tray with broth, bread, and cool water. Thomas helped Jane sit up enough to eat, supporting her shoulders while she managed a few spoonfuls of broth and a bit of bread. The shaking had mostly subsided now, reduced to occasional tremors in her hands. "You should rest," Thomas said when she had eaten what she could. "The laudanum will help you sleep." "I'm afraid to sleep," Jane admitted. "Afraid I'll wake up and the shaking will start again." "Then I'll stay until you fall asleep," Thomas said. "And if the shaking starts, I'll be right here to help you breathe through it." Jane settled back against the pillows, her hand still loosely holding his. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. You're someone who needs help," Thomas said. "That's enough." He sat with her as the laudanum took effect, watching her eyelids grow heavy, her breathing deepen. Even in sleep, small tremors occasionally ran through her, echoes of the panic that had consumed her earlier. Each time, Thomas squeezed her hand gently and the tremors would ease. The sun was setting when Margaret came to check on them, painting the sky outside in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the whole world on fire. "You can go now, Tom," Margaret said softly from the doorway. "I'll watch over her." Thomas looked down at Jane's sleeping face, at the hand still curled around his, and felt something shift in his chest. "I'll come back in the morning. Make sure she's all right." "That might not be wise," Margaret said, though her voice was gentle. "She's engaged to another man, Tom. Best not to let yourself get attached." "I'm just making sure she's all right," Thomas said, but even he could hear the lie in his words. He carefully extracted his hand from Jane's, replaced it with a spare pillow that she immediately clutched, and made his way out of the saloon into the cooling evening air. The street was quieter now, most folks having gone home for supper. Thomas stood for a moment, looking up at the window of room 3, and wondered what he had gotten himself into. The Sullivan Ranch where Thomas worked was owned by Patrick Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had struck it rich in the California gold rush and used his earnings to build a cattle empire in Arizona. Patrick was a fair boss, demanding but generous, and he gave Thomas a knowing look when he finally rode in well after dark. "Heard you played hero today," Patrick said, sitting on his porch with a whiskey in hand. "Rescued a mail-order bride from heat exhaustion." "News travels fast," Thomas muttered, dismounting and leading his horse toward the barn. Always does. Also heard the bride is intended for Richard Thornton. Thomas didn't respond, focusing on unsaddling his horse and brushing her down. Thornton's a hard man, Patrick continued, following Thomas into the barn. Cold, been through 3 wives already. First one died in childbirth, second one ran off, third one died of pneumonia, or so he says. Thomas's hand stilled on the brush. What are you implying? Nothing I can prove, Patrick said carefully. But the third wife had bruises, Tom. Doc Harrison saw them when he treated her for the pneumonia. She was scared of something, and I don't think it was just being sick. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? Thomas demanded. Because Thornton's rich and powerful, and dead women don't testify, Patrick said bluntly. And because in this territory, a man's business with his wife is considered his own affair. But if that girl is shaking with fear before she even meets him, maybe her instincts are trying to tell her something. Thomas finished with his horse and turned to face his boss. What am I supposed to do about it? She's contracted to marry him. She came all the way from Philadelphia. I don't know, Patrick admitted. But I know you, Tom. You've got a protective streak wider than the Colorado River. You pulled that girl from the Stagecoach and now you feel responsible for her. Just be careful. Thornton won't take kindly to anyone interfering with his business. That night, Thomas lay in his bunk in the ranch house and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He kept seeing Jane's face, pale and frightened, her whole body trembling with terror. He kept feeling her hand clutching his, desperate for something solid to hold on to. And he kept hearing her words. I thought I would die in that coach and nobody would care. He cared. That was the problem. After just a few hours after holding her hand and talking her through her panic, he cared far too much about a woman who belonged to someone else. When dawn broke, Thomas was already up and dressed, making excuses to Patrick about needing supplies from town. Patrick just shook his head and waved him off. Bring her some flowers, he called after Thomas. Women like flowers. It's not like that, Thomas protested. Keep telling yourself that, boy, Patrick said with a knowing grin. Jerome Junction was just waking up when Thomas rode in. Shopkeepers opening their doors, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Thomas stopped there first, buying rolls still warm from the oven, then headed to the Dusty Rose Saloon. Margaret was sweeping the front steps. She gave him a long look but didn't comment, just jerked her head toward the stairs. She's been awake for an hour. Asked about you. Thomas's heart did something complicated in his chest. How is she? Better. No shaking this morning, though she seems nervous. Thornton sent a telegram. He'll be here tomorrow to collect her. Tomorrow, Thomas repeated, and it felt like a countdown. He climbed the stairs and knocked softly on the door of room 3. Jane's voice, stronger than yesterday, called for him to enter. She was sitting up in bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a clean nightgown that Margaret must have provided. In the morning light streaming through the window, Thomas could see that she was beautiful, with delicate features and those remarkable green eyes. But it was the way her face lit up when she saw him that made his breath catch. You came back, she said, and there was wonder in her voice. Said I would, Thomas replied, suddenly feeling awkward with the paper bag of rolls in his hand. Brought you breakfast. You're very kind, Jane said as he settled into the chair beside the bed and handed her the bag. She pulled out a roll and took a small bite, closing her eyes in pleasure. Oh, this is wonderful. I haven't had proper bread in days. How are you feeling? Thomas asked, studying her carefully. She still looked tired, shadows under her eyes, but the wild panic was gone from her face. Better, Jane said. The shaking stopped. I slept without nightmares. I feel almost human again. She paused, looking down at her hands. Thank you for yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Anyone would have helped, Thomas said. No, Jane said firmly, not the way you did. You didn't just help me out of the coach, you stayed. You held my hand and told me to breathe, and you treated me like I mattered. Do you know how long it's been since anyone treated me like I mattered? Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He watched her eat another bite of roll, noticed how her hands remained steady now, how different she looked from the terrified woman he had carried from the stagecoach. Your husband to be sent a telegram, Thomas said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He'll be here tomorrow. Jane's hands stilled, and for a moment Thomas saw fear flicker across her face again. But she took a deep breath, deliberately, the way he had taught her, and the fear subsided. I knew he would, she said quietly. I'm contracted to him. I took his money for passage. I gave my word. You don't have to go through with it, Thomas said, the words escaping before he could stop them. If you're scared of him, if something doesn't feel right, you can change your mind. Jane looked at him with sad wisdom in her eyes. Can I? I have no money, no family here, no way to get home. And even if I did go home, my family would be ruined. My sisters would never find respectable husbands. My mother would be cast out of society. I made a promise, Mr. Xavier. Women like me don't have the luxury of changing our minds. It's Thomas, he said, or Tom. And there are always choices, Jane. They might not be easy ones, but they exist. What would I do here? Jane asked, not angrily, just practically. I have no skills for frontier life. I can't cook over an open fire or churn butter or shoot a gun. I was raised to pour tea and manage servants and make polite conversation. The only thing I'm qualified for is being a wife, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she could learn, that she could build a new life, that she didn't have to marry a man who might hurt her. But he also understood the truth in her words. Life for a single woman in the Arizona territory was harsh, opportunities scarce. Will you tell me about Philadelphia? He asked instead, changing the subject. What was your life like there? Jane's expression softened, and she spent the next hour painting pictures with her words. She told him about cobblestone streets and gas lamps, about the big house where she had grown up with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. She described her father's laugh, her mother's garden, her younger sister's mischief. She spoke of balls and parties, of museums and theaters, of a life so far removed from Jerome Junction that it might as well have been on another planet. Thomas listened, asking questions, watching her face animate as she talked. He told her about his own childhood, simpler but happy, about parents who had loved him fiercely, until fever took them both within days of each other. He described working cattle drives, sleeping under stars, the satisfaction of honest work and the beauty of wild places. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon, Margaret bringing up lunch and giving Thomas a disapproving look that he ignored. He knew he should leave, knew he was only making things harder for both of them, but he couldn't seem to make himself stand up and walk away. You'll make some woman very happy someday, Jane said as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the window. Jane, Thomas said, then stopped. He didn't know what he wanted to say, that he wished she wasn't engaged, that he wished they had met under different circumstances. That in the span of a single day and night, she had become important to him in a way he didn't fully understand. I know, Jane said softly, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I feel it too, this connection between us. But tomorrow Mr. Thornton comes, and I'll leave with him and you'll stay here and that will be the end of it. It doesn't have to be, Thomas said. Yes, Jane said gently. It does. Because I'm not brave enough to choose the unknown over the certain, even if the certain terrifies me. I'm not brave like you think I am. You're the bravest person I know, Thomas said fiercely, but bravery shouldn't mean sacrificing yourself. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of tomorrow pressing down on them both. Finally, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face stern. "Tom, you need to go. Doc Harrison's coming to check on Miss Wilson, and it's not proper for you to be here." Thomas knew she was right. He stood, every muscle protesting the movement, and looked down at Jane. "If you need anything," he said, "if you're ever in trouble, find a way to send word to the Sullivan Ranch. I'll come." "I know you would," Jane said. "That's what makes this so hard." Thomas left before he could do something foolish like beg her not to marry Thornton or offer to take her away himself with no plan and no prospects. He rode back to the ranch in a daze, and Patrick took one look at his face and didn't ask any questions. Just handed him a bottle and pointed him toward his bunk. That night, Thomas dreamed of green eyes and trembling hands, of a woman who smiled at him like he was worth something, and he woke with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with whiskey. The next day dawned clear and hot, and Thomas tried to lose himself in work. He rode fence lines, checked water sources, rounded up stray cattle, anything to keep his mind occupied. But as the sun climbed higher, he found himself riding back toward town, unable to stay away. He told himself he just wanted to make sure Jane was all right, that she wasn't shaking again. He told himself it was simple human decency to check on someone who had been ill. He told himself a lot of things, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. He needed to see her one more time. Richard Thornton arrived in Jerome Junction around 3 in the afternoon, riding in a fancy carriage that looked absurd on the rough frontier roads. He was exactly as Thomas had pictured him. Tall, thin, with gray hair and a face like carved granite. His eyes were cold, assessing everything with the air of a man who calculated value and found most things wanting. Thomas watched from outside the general store as Thornton climbed down from his carriage and strode into the dusty Rose Saloon. Every instinct screamed at Thomas to follow, to make sure Jane was all right, but he forced himself to stay where he was. She had made her choice. It wasn't his place to interfere. But when 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, and neither Thornton nor Jane emerged, Thomas's resolve crumbled. He crossed the street and pushed through the saloon doors. Margaret was behind the bar, polishing glasses with more force than necessary. She jerked her head toward the stairs without speaking. Thomas climbed them 2 at a time and heard the voices before he reached room 3. Thornton's was cold and sharp, Jane's pleading. "I paid good money for passage and expect what I was promised," Thornton was saying. "I don't appreciate delays or excuses." "I was ill, Mr. Thornton. The doctor can verify. You look healthy enough now. Pack your things. We leave within the hour." Thomas should have knocked. He should have announced himself. Instead, he threw the door open hard enough that it banged against the wall. Thornton spun around, his face flushing with anger. "Who the devil are you?" "Thomas Xavier," Thomas said, keeping his voice level though his heart was pounding. "I'm the man who pulled Miss Wilson from the stagecoach when she was suffering from heat exhaustion and panic. I wanted to make sure she was recovering well." Jane was standing near the window, dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue, her hair pinned up properly. She looked composed, ladylike, every inch the Philadelphia socialite she had been raised to be. But Thomas saw her hands. They were shaking again. "I appreciate your concern," Thornton said coldly, "but Miss Wilson is my betrothed and her health is now my concern. You may go." "I'd like to hear from Miss Wilson that she's ready to travel," Thomas said, looking past Thornton to Jane. "She was quite ill 2 days ago. Doc Harrison recommended rest." "I'm sure Miss Wilson can speak for herself," Thornton said. "Can't you, my dear?" It wasn't a question. It was a command. and Thomas saw Jane's face go pale as she understood the dynamics of the relationship she was entering. "I'm well enough to travel," Jane said, but her voice trembled. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Xavier." "Your hands are shaking," Thomas said gently. "It's nothing," Jane said quickly, tucking her hands into her skirts. "Just nerves about the journey." "You're upsetting her," Thornton said, stepping between Thomas and Jane. "I'll ask you once more to leave, and if you don't, I'll have the sheriff escort you out." Thomas looked at Jane over Thornton's shoulder. "Are you certain this is what you want?" "What she wants is irrelevant," Thornton said. "She's contracted to marry me. The matter is settled." "Jane," Thomas said, ignoring Thornton completely, "look at me." Jane's eyes met his, and Thomas saw everything in that gaze: fear, resignation, a desperate plea for help that she couldn't voice aloud. "Breathe with me," Thomas said softly, the same words he had spoken 2 days ago. "Remember, in and out." He saw the memory flicker across Jane's face, saw her take a shaky breath in rhythm with his. "That's enough," Thornton snapped. "Sheriff." "Someone get the sheriff, I'm going," Thomas said, but he kept his eyes on Jane. "But if you need help, any help at all, you know where to find me." He left before Thornton could summon law enforcement, but he didn't leave town. Instead, he settled himself outside the saloon, leaning against the hitching post in the shade, and waited. Margaret came out after a few minutes. "You're going to get yourself in trouble, Tom." "Probably," Thomas agreed. "She's engaged to another man, I know." "There's nothing you can do." "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but I can make sure she leaves safely, that Thornton doesn't hurt her on the way out." Margaret sighed. "You're a fool, Tom Xavier." "A good-hearted fool, but a fool nonetheless." When Jane finally emerged from the saloon, she was carrying a small carpet bag, her face composed but pale. Thornton had his hand clamped around her elbow, steering her toward his carriage with barely concealed impatience. Thomas stood as they passed, catching Jane's eye. She gave him a small, sad smile and mouthed, "Thank you." Then Thornton was helping her into the carriage, climbing in after her, and the driver was whipping the horses into motion. Thomas watched the carriage disappear down the dusty road toward Prescott, and felt like something vital had been torn out of his chest. Patrick found him an hour later, still standing in the same spot. "Come on, boy. Nothing more to see here." "He's going to hurt her," Thomas said. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do. I saw it in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was property he'd purchased and found unsatisfactory. The way he talked to her, and she knows it too. That's why she was shaking." "Even if that's true," Patrick said carefully, "what can you do about it?" "She's his wife now, or will be soon enough." Thomas didn't answer because he didn't have one. He just knew that somewhere in his bones, in the marrow of his being, something was deeply wrong. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by letting Jane Wilson ride away. The days that followed were some of the longest of Thomas's life. He threw himself into work, riding harder, working longer, trying to exhaust himself enough that he could sleep without dreaming of green eyes and trembling hands. It didn't work. A week after Jane left, Patrick approached him in the barn. "Tom, I need you to make a run up to Prescott. Deliver some contracts to my lawyer there. Might take a few days." Thomas looked up sharply. "Prescott? That's right. Near where Thornton's ranch is, I believe." Patrick's face was carefully neutral. "Thought you might want the opportunity to see for yourself that she's all right." "Patrick, I'm not suggesting you do anything stupid," Patrick interrupted. "Just that sometimes a man needs to see with his own eyes before he can let something go. Consider it a business trip that happens to take you in that direction." Thomas left the next morning before dawn, Patrick's contracts in his saddlebag and his heart in his throat. The ride to Prescott normally took 2 days, but Thomas pushed hard and made it in a day and a half, arriving in the larger town dusty and tired. He delivered the contracts first, conducting his legitimate business before doing anything else. Then, feeling like a fool and a stalker but unable to stop himself, he made discreet inquiries about Richard Thornton's ranch. The bartender at the saloon where he stopped for dinner was happy to talk. Thornton's place, big spread about 10 miles north of town. Rich bastard, excuse my language, keeps to himself mostly. Just got married again, I heard. 4th wife. That man goes through women like most men go through horses. You don't like him, Thomas observed. The bartender leaned in conspiratorially. Between you and me, no, there's something off about him, and his wives never seem to last long, always some tragedy, makes a man wonder. Thomas wondered too. He wondered all through dinner and all through the ride north the next morning, following directions to Thornton's ranch. He had no plan, no real reason to be there beyond a gnawing need to see that Jane was all right. The Thornton ranch was indeed impressive. A sprawling hacienda-style house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals full of prime livestock. Thomas approached openly, figuring honesty was less suspicious than sneaking around. A ranch hand stopped him at the gate. "Help you?" "Name's Thomas Xavier. I'm from Jerome Junction, came up on business. Wanted to pay my respects to Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, as I was the one who helped Mrs. Thornton when she took ill during her journey." The ranch hand looked uncertain but finally nodded. "Wait here. I'll see if they're receiving visitors." Thomas waited, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. The sun beat down mercilessly and sweat trickled down his spine. He was starting to think this was a terrible idea when the front door of the house opened and Jane stepped out. She looked different. Her hair was styled elaborately, her dress expensive and fashionable. But as she came closer, Thomas saw the shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth, the way she held herself carefully as if movement hurt. "Mr. Xavier," she said formally, but her voice wavered slightly. "This is unexpected." "I was in Prescott on business," Thomas said, dismounting. "Thought I'd check that you arrived safely and are well." "As you can see, I'm perfectly well," Jane said, but her eyes told a different story. They pleaded with him to understand something, to see what she couldn't say aloud. "Your hands," Thomas said softly. They were clasped tightly in front of her, and he could see the fine tremors running through them. "It's nothing," Jane said quickly. "Just the heat." "Is your husband home?" Thomas asked. "He's in town on business, won't be back until this evening." "Then perhaps you could offer a weary traveler some water," Thomas said. "And we could talk for a few minutes." Jane hesitated, glancing back at the house, then nodded. "Of course. It's the least I can do after your kindness in Jerome Junction." She led him not into the house, but around to a small garden area shaded by cottonwoods, where a bench sat near a fountain. As soon as they were out of sight of the house, Jane's composure crumbled. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered urgently. "If Richard finds out, has he hurt you?" Thomas asked bluntly. Jane's silence was answer enough. She sat down heavily on the bench, her hands shaking harder now. "Talk to me," Thomas said gently, sitting beside her. "Tell me what's happening." "He hasn't beaten me," Jane said carefully. "Not with fists. But his words are like knives, Tom. Everything I do is wrong. The way I walk, the way I speak, the way I arrange flowers or pour tea. He finds fault in everything. And when he's angry, he grips my arms so hard they bruise." She pushed up her long sleeves slightly, and Thomas saw the finger-shaped marks on her pale skin. "He says I'm his property now, that he paid good money for me, and I'll learn to be the wife he wants, or I'll regret it." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "You've been here a week." 9 days, Jane corrected. "It feels like 9 years." She looked at him with desperate eyes. I made a terrible mistake, Tom. I thought I could endure anything for my family, but I can't. I can't live like this. But I don't know what to do. We're married now. By law, I'm his property. I have nowhere to go, no money of my own. Come with me, Thomas said, the words escaping before he had time to think them through. Right now. Get on my horse and come with me. I can't, Jane said, tears spilling down her cheeks. Don't you understand? He'd come after us. He'd have the law on his side. A woman can't just leave her husband, and even if I could, I'd ruin you, ruin your reputation, your life. I can't do that to you. I don't care, Thomas said fiercely. Jane, listen to me. I've known you for less than 2 weeks, and most of that time we were apart. But I know this, I care about you, more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I can't ride away from here knowing you're in danger. You have to, Jane said, wiping at her tears, because I'm not brave enough to leave. Because the consequences are too great, because I made my choice and now I have to live with it. That's not courage, that's martyrdom, Thomas said, and you're worth more than that. Am I? Jane asked bitterly. I'm a purchased bride who couldn't even make it through her first week without falling apart. I'm weak and useless and— Stop, Thomas said, taking her shaking hands in his. Breathe with me. Remember, Jane looked at him, and despite everything, a small smile touched her lips. You keep saving me. I'll keep saving you as many times as it takes, Thomas said, until you believe you're worth saving. They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, breathing together, the fountain trickling peacefully beside them, and Thomas made a decision. I'm staying in Prescott for a few days, he said. At the Trail's End Hotel. If you change your mind, if you find the courage, or if he hurts you worse than this, you get word to me. I don't care if it's the middle of the night. I don't care if all hell is breaking loose. You send word and I'll come for you. Thomas, promise me, he insisted. Promise me you'll at least think about it. Think about the fact that you have a choice, that you deserve better than this, that there's a life waiting for you where you don't have to shake with fear every day. I promise I'll think about it, Jane said softly, but I can't promise more than that. It wasn't enough, but it was all Thomas was going to get. He stayed another few minutes, long enough to be polite, then rode away before Thornton could return. But he didn't leave Prescott. Instead, he checked into the Trail's End Hotel, sent a telegram to Patrick explaining he'd be delayed, and settled in to wait. 3 days passed. Thomas made discreet inquiries around town, learning what he could about Thornton. The picture that emerged was ugly. Thornton was respected for his wealth and feared for his temper. His ranch hands were paid well but turned over frequently. The previous wives were spoken of in hushed tones, and nobody seemed to want to say too much about how they had died. On the 4th day, a boy of about 10 appeared at Thomas's hotel room, clutching a crumpled note. Lady gave me 4 bits to bring this to Thomas Xavier, the boy said breathlessly. Thomas's heart lurched. He took the note with shaking hands, gave the boy $1, and unfolded the paper. The message was simple, written in a shaking hand. Tonight, after dark, Garden Gate, please. Thomas spent the rest of the day preparing. He bought supplies, a second horse, women's riding clothes. He checked his gun, counted his money, and made a plan. If Jane was leaving Thornton, there would be consequences. They would need to move fast and far. As darkness fell, Thomas rode out toward Thornton's ranch, leading the extra horse, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He approached from the back, keeping to the shadows, and found the garden gate Jane had mentioned. She was already there, dressed in dark clothes, a small bag clutched in her hands. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. Thomas saw red. He did this. It doesn't matter, Jane said, her voice shaking. I'm leaving. I finally found my courage and I'm leaving. But Tom, you need to know what you're getting into. He'll come after us. He'll use every resource he has. We'll be fugitives. "I know," Thomas said. "I don't care, get on the horse." Jane hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the grand house that was supposed to have been her home. Then she squared her shoulders, put her foot in the stirrup, and pulled herself up into the saddle. They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Thornton's ranch. Thomas headed not back toward Jerome Junction but east, toward the wilder territories, where a man's past mattered less than his ability to survive. As dawn broke, they stopped near a creek to rest the horses and let Jane catch her breath. She was shaking again, but Thomas recognized it now as exhaustion and adrenaline rather than pure panic. "What have I done?" she whispered, staring at her hands. "I just destroyed both our lives." "No," Thomas said firmly, kneeling in front of her. "You saved them. Jane, you were dying in that house. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but slowly, piece by piece. You made the brave choice." "I'm so scared," Jane admitted. "I don't know where we're going or what we'll do or how we'll live." "Neither do I," Thomas said honestly, "but we'll figure it out together." Jane looked at him, her bruised face beautiful in the morning light. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." "I know enough," Thomas said. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you try to be strong for everyone else even when you're falling apart inside. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up everything around you. I know that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I pulled you from that stagecoach. And I know that I'm falling in love with you, Jane Wilson, and I'd rather be a fugitive with you than safe without you." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "I'm still married to him. In the eyes of the law, I'm his property." "Then we'll go where the law doesn't reach," Thomas said. "Or we'll fight to change it. Or we'll live quietly where nobody knows us and build a life anyway. I don't have all the answers, Jane, but I know I couldn't leave you there." Jane reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle despite their trembling. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "I know," Thomas said, covering her hand with his, "but remember what I taught you. When you're scared, just breathe. We'll figure out the rest one breath at a time." They rested for an hour, then continued riding. Thomas headed for a small settlement he knew of, far enough off the beaten path that they might find sanctuary while they figured out their next move. It was another 2 days hard riding, but they made it, exhausted and dusty and hungry. The settlement was called Copper Creek, barely more than a mining camp with pretensions of becoming a town. The people there asked few questions, more concerned with their own survival than anyone else's business. Thomas found them a small cabin to rent, using the last of his savings. It was rough, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and holes in the roof, but it was shelter. He left Jane there to rest while he went to find work. The mine was hiring, always hiring because the work was dangerous and men quit or died regularly. Thomas signed on, knowing the work would be brutal but the pay decent. He came back to the cabin as darkness fell, loaded down with basic supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee. Jane had made an attempt to clean the cabin, but exhaustion had clearly overtaken her. She was asleep on the rough wooden bed, still wearing the traveling clothes she had been in for 2 days. Her face, even in sleep, looked worn. Thomas set down his supplies and stood watching her, wondering what the hell he had done. He had destroyed his own life and reputation. He had stolen another man's wife. He had committed a crime that could see him hanged in some territories. And he didn't regret a single moment of it. He heated water, made simple food, and woke Jane gently when it was ready. She ate mechanically, still half asleep, then let him help her out of the dirty traveling clothes and into a clean shirt of his that served as a nightgown. "Tomorrow we'll get you proper clothes," Thomas said. "Tonight just rest." "Where will you sleep?" Jane asked, looking at the single bed. "Floor's fine," Thomas said. "Don't be ridiculous," Jane said. "The bed is big enough for two, and after what we've been through, I think we can manage to share it without scandal." She paused, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Besides, I'm already scandalous. Runaway wife, living in sin with another man. Might as well be comfortable." Thomas laughed despite everything and settled beside her on the bed, careful to leave space between them. But in the night, Jane moved closer, seeking warmth or comfort or simply the reassurance of another person. Thomas woke to find her curled against him, her head on his shoulder, her breathing deep and even. His arm was around her, holding her safe, and his heart felt so full it ached. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Thomas worked the mine, brutal hours in darkness and danger. Jane worked to make the cabin livable, learning to cook over an open fire, to patch holes and clean without servants. It was hard for both of them, harder than anything either had done before. But slowly, the cabin began to feel like a home. Jane stopped shaking. Or rather, she still trembled sometimes, but only when she was cold or tired, not from constant fear. The bruises faded from her face. She began to smile more, to laugh at Thomas's bad jokes, to sing softly while she worked. "I should miss Philadelphia," she said one evening as they ate dinner by firelight. "I should miss parties and pretty dresses and having servants, but I don't. Is that strange?" "No," Thomas said. "Those things came with a price you couldn't afford. This life is hard, but it's yours." "That makes all the difference." "Ours," Jane corrected. "This life is ours." A month passed, then two. Thomas made friends at the mine, men who asked no questions about his past. Jane befriended some of the other women in the settlement, learning skills she had never needed in Philadelphia. The cabin gradually transformed, Jane's touches evident in curtains made from flour sacks, wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, a patchwork quilt she was slowly piecing together. They lived as husband and wife, though they were no such thing. Thomas never pushed, never demanded more than Jane was willing to give. But gradually the space between them in the bed grew smaller. Gradually holding hands became natural, then stolen kisses, then more. The first time they made love, it was gentle and slow, Jane trembling again but for entirely different reasons. Thomas was patient, careful, worshipful. Afterward she cried and he held her, letting her release all the fear and pain she had been carrying. "I'm free," she whispered against his chest. "For the first time in my life, I'm truly free." They were happy. It shouldn't have been possible given the circumstances, but they were. Thomas would come home from the mine, exhausted and filthy, and Jane would heat water for him to wash. They would eat simple meals and talk for hours, sharing stories, dreams, fears. They would lie in bed at night, wrapped around each other, and feel like the richest people on earth. But happiness, Thomas had learned, was often borrowed, not owned, and debts eventually came due. 6 months after they arrived in Copper Creek, a stranger rode into town asking questions. He was a private detective, hired by Richard Thornton to find his missing wife and the man who had stolen her. Word reached Thomas through a friend at the mine. "Man's been asking about a couple matching your description," his friend said quietly. "Dark-haired man, late 20s, traveling with a refined woman with green eyes. Says there's a reward for information." Thomas felt his blood run cold. How much? $200. It was a fortune for the people in Copper Creek, enough to tempt even friends. Thomas went home immediately, bursting through the cabin door. Jane looked up from the stew she was stirring, saw his face, and went pale. "He found us," she said. "It wasn't a question. Sent a detective. We need to leave, tonight." They packed in frantic silence, taking only what they could carry. Thomas counted their money, $70, not nearly enough to get far, but it would have to do. They left Copper Creek as darkness fell, abandoning the cabin they had turned into a home, leaving behind the life they had built. Jane was crying silently, and Thomas felt like he was being torn in two. They rode through the night again, just like 6 months ago, but this time it was different. This time they were leaving something behind instead of running toward freedom. "This is my fault," Jane said as dawn broke. "You gave up everything for me, and all I've brought you is trouble." "You've brought me happiness," Thomas corrected. "These past 6 months have been the best of my life, Jane. Don't regret them." "How can I not? We're fugitives. We'll always be running. There's no future for us, no peace." "Then we keep running," Thomas said stubbornly. "I don't care, as long as I'm with you." But even as he said it, Thomas knew it wasn't sustainable. They couldn't run forever. Eventually, money would run out, or luck would run out, or they would just run out of places to run. They headed north this time, into Colorado, where the mountains were wild and remote, and a person could disappear if they tried hard enough. They found work on an isolated ranch, Thomas as a hand, Jane helping the rancher's wife with house and children. For a while, it worked. For a while, they were safe. They lived in a small room above the barn, cramped but cozy. They worked hard and kept their heads down and tried not to think about the sword hanging over them. But it was a half-life, Thomas realized. They couldn't marry properly. They couldn't put down real roots. They couldn't have children, couldn't build anything permanent. They existed in a kind of limbo, together but always looking over their shoulders. It was Jane who finally said what Thomas had been thinking. "We can't live like this forever." They were lying in bed, the autumn wind howling outside, frost forming on the window. Thomas held her close, trying to memorize the feel of her. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he feared he knew. "I'm saying maybe I should go back," Jane whispered. "Maybe if I return to Richard, he'll leave you alone. You could have your life back, Tom, a real life, not this endless running." "No," Thomas said fiercely. "No, I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me." "Isn't that what you did for me?" Jane asked. "You sacrificed everything. Your job, your reputation, your future, all for me." "Because I love you," Thomas said. "Because my life without you isn't worth having." "I love you too," Jane said, tears streaming down her face. "That's why I can't watch you suffer anymore. That's why I can't keep dragging you down." They argued through the night, neither willing to give ground. But Thomas saw the resignation building in Jane's eyes, saw her starting to believe there was no other way, and maybe there wasn't. Maybe they were fooling themselves, thinking they could outrun a rich, powerful man who saw Jane as property he owned. Maybe all they were doing was delaying the inevitable. Thomas was dwelling on these dark thoughts when the rancher, a good man named Henry Coulter, approached him in the barn one morning. "Need to talk to you, Tom," Henry said. "Or should I say Thomas Xavier?" Thomas's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt, but Henry held up his hands in a calming gesture. "Easy now. I'm not turning you in. But I know who you are. Had a letter from Patrick Sullivan, your old boss down in Jerome Junction. He's been looking for you." "Patrick knows where we are?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. "Now he does. I wrote him after you showed up, described you. He confirmed your identity and sent me this." Henry pulled a letter from his pocket. "Says you should read it, says it might be the answer you're looking for." Thomas took the letter with shaking hands and unfolded it. Patrick's familiar scrawl covered the page. "Tom, if you're reading this, you found a safe place. Good. Listen carefully. There might be a way out of your situation. Judge Martin Crawley, District Court in Prescott, is an old friend of mine. Owes me favors. More importantly, he hates Richard Thornton, has for years. Says Thornton bent too many rules, hurt too many people. The judge has been looking for a way to bring him down but needs evidence. Here's the thing. Thornton's last wife, Elizabeth, didn't die of pneumonia like he claimed. She died of injuries from a fall which the coroner ruled accidental. But the doctor who examined her told me confidentially that the injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall. He thinks she was pushed, but couldn't prove it. If Jane is willing to testify about what Thornton did to her, about the abuse and the threats, and if we can find one of his former ranch hands willing to talk about what they saw, we might be able to build a case. Not for murder necessarily, but for abuse. Enough to get Jane's marriage annulled on grounds of cruelty and fear for her life. It's legal in some territories, and Judge Crawley would be sympathetic. It's a risk. You'd have to come back, face charges for absconding with another man's wife. But Judge Crawley thinks he can get those charges dismissed if Jane testifies that she left of her own free will to escape abuse. It's not guaranteed, Tom, but it's a chance. A real chance at her real life. Come see me if you want to try. I'll help however I can. You're like a son to me, and I want to see you happy. Both of you. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding. Then he ran to find Jane. She was in the ranch house kitchen, helping Mrs. Coulter bake bread. Thomas burst in without knocking, clutching the letter. "We have a chance," he said breathlessly. "A real chance." He explained everything while Jane listened, her face cycling through hope, fear, and disbelief. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "It's risky," she finally said. "We could end up worse off than we are now. You could hang for abducting me." "But if it works," Thomas said, "we could be free. Really free. No more running. No more looking over our shoulders. We could get married properly, have a home, have children, have a future." Jane looked at him with those green eyes that had haunted him from the first moment. "You'd risk your life for that." "I'd risk anything for you," Thomas said simply. "But this time it's your choice. I'm not making it for you. Whatever you decide, I'll support it." Jane was quiet for a long time. Then she took a deep breath, the way Thomas had taught her all those months ago in Jerome Junction. "Let's do it," she said. "Let's take the risk. Let's fight for our future." The journey back to Arizona took weeks. They traveled carefully, avoiding main roads, sending messages ahead to Patrick to arrange everything. By the time they reached Jerome Junction, it was early spring of 1884. Nearly a year since Jane had first arrived on that stagecoach, shaking and terrified. Patrick met them at the edge of town, embracing Thomas like the son he had mentioned in his letter. He was kind to Jane, treating her with respect and not an ounce of judgment. "Judge Crawley is waiting," Patrick said. "We've got one of Thornton's former ranch hands willing to testify. Man named Carlos Mendez. He left Thornton's employ after the last wife died, said he couldn't stomach what he was seeing anymore. But he's scared, Tom. Thornton's powerful, and testifying against him is dangerous." "We're all scared," Thomas said, holding Jane's hand tightly. "But we're doing it anyway." The trial, when it came, was the talk of the territory. Richard Thornton arrived with expensive lawyers, his face coldly furious. Thomas had to be physically restrained when Thornton tried to approach Jane. Judge Crawley, a stern man with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes, kept order in his courtroom with an iron fist. He listened to testimony for 3 days. Jane testified first, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she spoke. She detailed the abuse, the threats, the constant atmosphere of fear. She showed the court her journal, which she had kept hidden, documenting each incident. She described how she felt she had been sold like livestock, how Thornton viewed her as property rather than a person. Carlos Mendez testified next, speaking in halting English about what he had witnessed. The way Thornton treated his wives, the bruises everyone pretended not to see, the night Elizabeth Thornton died and how the house was in chaos. Thornton screaming that she had fallen down the stairs, But Carlos had seen something else. He had seen Elizabeth at the top of the stairs, backing away from Thornton, her face terrified, and then she was falling, and Thornton was standing there, his hand still extended. "I cannot say for certain he pushed her," Carlos admitted, his voice breaking. "But I saw his hand near her. I saw her fear. And I heard him say afterward, when he thought no one was listening, that she should have learned to obey." The courtroom erupted. Thornton's lawyers objected strenuously, but Judge Crawley allowed the testimony. Thomas testified last, describing how he found Jane shaking and terrified in the stagecoach, how he had seen the bruises on her arms after just 9 days of marriage, how she had begged him for help with her eyes even when she couldn't say the words aloud. "I don't deny that I helped her leave," Thomas said clearly. "I don't deny that we've been living together, but I do deny that I abducted her. She came with me of her own free will to escape a man who was hurting her. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat, because no law is just that tells a woman she has to stay with someone who's killing her piece by piece." Thornton's lawyers painted Thomas as a home wrecker, Jane as a faithless wife who broke her contract. They argued property rights and the sanctity of marriage. They suggested Jane and Thomas had been having an affair from the moment she arrived, that the whole thing was a scheme to defraud Thornton. But Judge Crawley had heard enough. After a day of deliberation, he rendered his verdict. "This court finds that the marriage between Richard Thornton and Jane Wilson was entered into under false pretenses, with Mr. Thornton misrepresenting his character and intentions. Further, this court finds credible evidence of abuse and cruelty, which under territorial law constitutes grounds for annulment. The marriage is hereby annulled. Mrs. Wilson is free of all obligation to Mr. Thornton. As for the charges of abduction against Mr. Xavier, this court finds that Mrs. Wilson left of her own volition to escape a dangerous situation, and therefore no crime was committed. The charges are dismissed. Furthermore, this court is recommending a full investigation into the death of Elizabeth Thornton. Mr. Thornton, you should consult with your lawyers, as you may be facing more serious charges." The courtroom exploded. Thornton was on his feet, shouting. His lawyers were protesting. But Judge Crawley brought down his gavel with thunderous finality. "This court is adjourned." Thomas caught Jane as she collapsed, sobbing with relief. Patrick was there too, supporting both of them, his face split in a huge grin. "It's over," Jane kept saying. "It's really over." "It's over," Thomas confirmed, holding her tight. "You're free. We're free." Richard Thornton left Prescott that night, fleeing before the investigation into his previous wife's death could gain momentum. Word reached Jerome Junction a month later that he had died in a fall from his horse while crossing the mountains. Whether it was an accident or something else, no one could say. But Thomas thought there was perhaps justice in a man who pushed others meeting his own end in a fall. Thomas and Jane were married in June of 1884 in the little church in Jerome Junction with the bell that rang every Sunday. Margaret from the Dusty Rose Saloon cried through the whole ceremony. Patrick walked Jane down the aisle, proud as any father. Half the town attended and the other half sent good wishes. "Breathe with me," Thomas whispered as they stood before the minister, and Jane laughed through happy tears. "I don't need to," she whispered back. "I'm not shaking anymore." But she breathed with him anyway, their rhythm matching, the way it had from the very beginning. Patrick gave them a piece of land from his ranch as a wedding present, enough to start their own small spread. Thomas and Jane built a house together, a real house with proper walls and a good roof. Jane painted it blue, the color of possibility, and planted flowers in the dooryard. The house filled slowly over the years. First came a son, born in 1885, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Patrick after the man who had saved them. Then came twin girls in 1887, auburn-haired and spirited. Then another boy in 1890, quiet and thoughtful. Jane learned to be a rancher's wife, though she never stopped being herself. She started a school in Jerome Junction, teaching children to read and write. She wrote letters to her family in Philadelphia, rebuilding bridges that had been burned. Her mother eventually came to visit and ended up staying, charmed by her grandchildren and the wild beauty of Arizona. Thomas worked his land and raised his cattle and loved his wife with a devotion that became legendary in Jerome Junction. People would see them in town together, still holding hands after years of marriage, still looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. "You saved me," Jane told him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the red rocks. Their children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. 20 years had passed since that day in the stagecoach, but Thomas remembered it like yesterday. "We saved each other," Thomas corrected. "You taught me what it means to be brave, to risk everything for something that matters." "I was so scared that day," Jane said, "shaking so hard I thought I would fly apart. And then you took my hand and told me to breathe with you, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore." "You were never alone," Thomas said. "From that moment on, you were never alone." Jane leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. The oldest, Patrick, was teaching his younger siblings to rope a fence post. The twins were arguing good-naturedly about something. The youngest was picking wildflowers, probably for his mother. "You ever regret it?" Jane asked. "Giving up your old life, the years we spent running?" "Not for a second," Thomas said without hesitation. "Those years led us here. To this house, this family, this life. I'd do it all again." "So would I," Jane said. "Every frightening, uncertain, beautiful moment of it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas Xavier held his wife's hand and thought about that day long ago when a stagecoach had brought a woman who couldn't stop shaking. He thought about the fear in her green eyes, the desperation in her grip, the trembling that had run through her entire body. And he thought about how sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was reach out when they were terrified, and hold on when everything told them to let go. About how sometimes love meant risking everything, not knowing if you'd end up with something beautiful or lose it all. They had risked everything. And they had won. The children ran up to the porch as darkness fell, clamoring for dinner and stories. Jane stood, brushing off her skirt, and Thomas followed her inside to the warm, bright kitchen that smelled of bread and home. Young Patrick helped his father light the lamps while the twins set the table. The youngest climbed into his mother's lap, and Jane kissed his hair, her hands steady and sure as they prepared the evening meal. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Thomas and Jane stood at their bedroom window, looking out at their land bathed in moonlight. "Thank you," Jane whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me that day in the stagecoach. Really seeing me, not just a woman who was shaking, but a person who needed help. For holding my hand. For teaching me to breathe. For giving me a reason to be brave." Thomas turned her to face him, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands. "You were always brave, Jane. You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." "We were good for each other," Jane said. "We still are," Thomas replied, and kissed her with all the love of 20 years and all the promise of the years still to come. Outside, the Arizona night sang with crickets and coyotes, with the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of an owl. The land that had tested them, challenged them, nearly broken them, now held them safe. The territory that had been harsh and unforgiving had become home. And in a small blue house on the edge of Jerome Junction, a family slept peacefully, built on a foundation of courage and trust, and a moment of connection in a dusty stagecoach when one man had reached out to a frightened woman and said the words that changed both their lives. "Breathe with me." The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Thomas and Jane's ranch grew modestly but steadily. They never became wealthy like Richard Thornton had been, but they had something infinitely more valuable: a home filled with love, children who knew they were cherished, and a community that respected them. Young Patrick grew tall and strong, eventually taking over much of the ranch work from his aging father. He married a girl from town, a blacksmith's daughter with a quick smile and capable hands, and they built a house on the far corner of Xavier land. The twins, Mary and Margaret, named after the women who had helped their mother, both became teachers like Jane. Mary moved to Prescott to teach there, while Margaret stayed in Jerome Junction and eventually took over her mother's school. The youngest, David, inherited his mother's literary bent and became a journalist, traveling the territory and writing stories about the people and places that made the West what it was. He wrote often about his parents, about the courage it took to build a life in harsh country, about the love story that started with a trembling hand and a gentle voice saying, "Breathe with me." As Thomas and Jane grew older, their hair turning gray, their hands gnarled by years of work, they became fixtures in Jerome Junction. Jane's school produced generations of educated children. Thomas served on the town council, helping guide Jerome Junction's growth from mining camp to proper town. They were respected, beloved, the kind of couple young people pointed to as proof that true love existed. Jane's mother lived with them until she passed peacefully in 1898, surrounded by the grandchildren she had never expected to have. Jane's sisters eventually visited from Philadelphia, marveling at how their refined sister had become this strong, capable woman who could birth a calf and teach Shakespeare with equal skill. There were hard times, too. The twins nearly died of scarlet fever when they were 7. A drought in 1892 nearly broke them financially. David was thrown from a horse and lay unconscious for 3 days while Jane sat beside him, holding his hand and breathing slowly and steadily until he opened his eyes again. Young Patrick lost his first child, a daughter, to pneumonia, and Thomas held his grown son while he wept. But through it all, Thomas and Jane faced life together. When one faltered, the other was there to provide strength. When Jane had nightmares about Richard Thornton, Thomas held her and reminded her she was safe. When Thomas worried about money or drought or the future, Jane talked him through his fears with the same patience he had once shown her. In 1903, on their 19th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch they had built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their children once had. Young Patrick's children were there, 4 of them ranging from 12 down to 4. The twins had no children yet, but Margaret was engaged. David had brought home a young woman he was courting, a schoolteacher from Flagstaff with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner. "Can you believe it's been 19 years?" Jane asked, her hand finding Thomas's automatically, the way it always did. "Can you believe it's been 20 years since you arrived in that stagecoach?" Thomas countered. Jane was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." That woman who couldn't stop shaking, who was so afraid she thought she might die, she feels like a stranger now. "She's still in there," Thomas said. "She's just stronger now, braver. But you're still the same woman I fell in love with in those first few moments, even though I didn't realize it at the time." "When did you realize?" Jane asked. "That you loved me," Thomas considered. I think part of me knew from the very first. When I saw you shaking in that coach, something in me recognized you. But I really knew for certain when I left you with Thornton and felt like my heart was being torn out. I rode back to Patrick's ranch, and all I could think was that I just made the biggest mistake of my life. When Patrick told me Thornton's history, when he gave me that excuse to go to Prescott, I knew I was going to do whatever it took to be near you again, even if that meant just making sure you were safe. I couldn't have stayed away if I'd wanted to. I knew in the garden, Jane said softly. When you found me at Thornton's ranch, you asked if he had hurt me, and you looked so angry, so protective. And I realized that this man, this stranger, cared more about my well-being than anyone else in my life ever had, including my own family who sold me like property. I knew then that I loved you, and when you said to come with you, every reasonable part of my brain screamed that it was insane, but my heart said yes immediately. We were insane, Thomas said with a laugh. Running off with no plan, no money, no idea what we'd do. Best insane decision I ever made, Jane said. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the grandchildren play. The oldest, young Patrick's son Thomas, was teaching the younger ones to ride, patient and gentle like his grandfather. The sight made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. We did good, didn't we? Jane asked, as if reading his thoughts. Despite everything, despite the fear and the running and the trial, we built something good. We built something extraordinary, Thomas said. Look at them, Jane. Look at our children and grandchildren. They're healthy and happy and loved. They know their worth. They're not property to be bought and sold. They're not afraid to be themselves. That's because of you, because you were brave enough to save yourself and smart enough to teach them that courage matters. Because we were brave together, Jane corrected. I couldn't have done any of it without you. As the sun began to set, painting the familiar landscape in shades of amber and rose, their children gathered on the porch. Young Patrick brought coffee. Margaret brought pie. Mary and her husband arrived with their own children. David came with his young woman, introducing her properly to his parents. They ate together as the stars came out, 3 generations sharing food and laughter and stories. Young Patrick told his children about their grandfather's skill with horses. The twins shared memories of their mother's school, of lessons learned and mischief made. David raved from his latest article about the changing West and the people who had built it. Tell us the story, one of the grandchildren pleaded, about how Grandma and Grandpa met. It was a story they'd heard countless times, but children never tired of it. Jane looked at Thomas and he nodded, gesturing for her to tell it. Well, Jane began, her voice taking on the storytelling cadence she'd perfected over years of teaching. I came to Arizona on a stagecoach, traveling to marry a man I'd never met. I was so frightened that I couldn't stop shaking. I thought I would fall apart right there in that dusty coach. And then Grandpa saved you, the youngest grandchild piped up. Then your grandfather took my hand, Jane continued, smiling at Thomas, and he told me to breathe with him. And somehow, just breathing with him, matching his rhythm, made me feel like maybe everything would be all right. He didn't know me. I was nothing to him. But he stayed with me, held my hand, talked me through my fear. He was the first person in a very long time who made me feel like I mattered. But she was supposed to marry someone else, Thomas picked up the story, a rich rancher. And I was just a ranch hand with nothing to my name. I knew I should walk away, let her live the life she was supposed to live. But I couldn't. Something about your grandmother grabbed hold of my heart and wouldn't let go. So Grandma ran away, another grandchild said, eyes wide. I did, Jane confirmed. I ran away with your grandfather, even though it was dangerous and foolish and we could have been caught and punished. But I knew that staying was more dangerous. I knew that a life without love, without kindness, without someone who saw me as a person rather than property, wasn't worth living. And you lived happily ever after, the youngest said contentedly. Not quite, Thomas said gently. Happy ever after isn't quite right. We lived. We struggled. We were scared sometimes. We didn't know if everything would work out. But we did it together, and that made all the difference. Happy isn't something that just happens at the end of a story. It's something you build day by day, choice by choice. The grandchildren listened, enthralled as they always were. The older ones, who understood more of the story's darker elements, looked at their grandparents with new appreciation. Young Patrick met his father's eyes across the porch, understanding passing between them about courage and sacrifice and love. As the evening wore on and the children began to yawn, families said their good nights and departed for their own homes. Young Patrick carried his youngest, already asleep, toward the house on the far corner. The twins left together, arm in arm, still as close as they'd been in the womb. David walked his young lady to her hotel in town, promising to call on her properly in the morning. Finally, Thomas and Jane were alone again, the house quiet around them. They prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, moving around each other in the small space they'd shared for 19 years. You think they understand? Jane asked as she brushed out her hair, now more silver than auburn. The children and grandchildren, do you think they understand what it cost us to build this life? They understand enough, Thomas said. They understand that we love each other, that we chose each other against all odds. That's the important part. Jane set down her brush and came to sit beside Thomas on the bed they'd shared for nearly 2 decades. I want them to know that love is worth fighting for. That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. They know, Thomas assured her. You've taught them that every day of their lives, just by being yourself, by building your school, by standing up for what you believe in, by loving them fiercely and unconditionally. They know. Jane leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close the way he'd done thousands of times before. Outside, the Arizona night sang its familiar song, and inside, 2 people who had once been strangers found comfort in each other's presence. I love you, Jane whispered. I've loved you since that day in the garden when you told me to come with you. I've loved you through every hard moment and every beautiful one, and I'll love you until my last breath. I love you too, Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her hair. From the moment I saw you shaking in that stagecoach, my heart was yours. It always will be. They settled into bed, and Thomas reached for Jane's hand the way he always did, the way he'd done that first day when she was shaking and scared and needed something solid to hold on to. Her hand was steady now, calm and sure, but he held it anyway because some habits were too precious to break in the darkness. Jane whispered, "Breathe with me." Thomas smiled, understanding. After 20 years, they still found comfort in that simple ritual, in matching their breathing, in being perfectly in sync with each other. Always, he promised, and they breathed together, in and out, 2 hearts beating as one until sleep claimed them both. The years continued their inexorable march. Thomas and Jane celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1909 with a party that brought together everyone in Jerome Junction who could fit in the town hall. Their children gave speeches, their grandchildren performed a play about the courage of pioneers, and Patrick Sullivan, now in his 80s, toasted them with tears in his eyes. I gave Tom some land as a wedding present, Patrick said, his voice still strong despite his years. Thought I was helping them get started, but I was wrong. Tom and Jane didn't need land to build a life. They had something more valuable than property, more lasting than gold. They had each other, and they had the courage to fight for that love. They built their fortune in laughter and children and years spent side by side. That's the richest kind of wealth there is. In 1911, Thomas had a heart scare that left him weak for months. Jane nursed him with patient devotion, and for the first time, Thomas understood fully what it must have been like for her that day in the stagecoach, to feel your body betraying you, to be frightened and unable to control it. "Breathe with me," Jane said, holding his hand when his heart raced and fear gripped him. "Remember, in and out, nice and slow." And Thomas did, drawing strength from his wife the way she had once drawn strength from him, marveling at how their roles had reversed, how they took turns being strong for each other. He recovered slowly, and though he never regained his full strength, he found peace in quieter pursuits. He sat on the porch more, watching his grandchildren grow. He taught young Thomas, his namesake, about ranching and life and love. He wrote letters to old friends, remembering the life he'd lived and the choices that had shaped it. "You have any regrets?" Young Thomas asked him one afternoon as they sat watching the cattle graze in the distance. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I regret that I didn't meet your grandmother sooner, that we lost years we could have had together. I regret the fear she suffered before I found her, the abuse she endured. But do I regret the choices we made, the life we built? Never, not for a single moment." "You really love her," young Thomas said. "It wasn't a question." "More than life itself," Thomas confirmed. "Your grandmother saved me just as surely as I saved her. She gave me purpose, family, a reason to be better than I was. She's the best part of me." "I want to find love like that someday," young Thomas said wistfully. "You will," Thomas promised. "And when you do, fight for it. Don't let fear or propriety or what other people think stop you. Love that deep, that true, is worth any price." In 1914, as the world outside their small corner of Arizona began sliding toward war, Thomas and Jane celebrated their 30th anniversary quietly, with just their immediate family. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and heart. They took a walk that evening, moving slowly, supporting each other, out to the spot where they'd first decided to build their house 30 years before. The house itself stood solid behind them, weathered but strong, just like their marriage. 30 years, Jane marveled. "When I stepped off that stagecoach, I never imagined I'd live to see 30 years of happiness." "Did you think you'd die young?" Thomas asked. "I thought I'd die piece by piece," Jane said honestly. "That I'd lose myself gradually in a loveless marriage until one day I'd just be gone even though my body still moved through the world. In a way, you didn't just save my life that day. You saved my soul." "You saved mine too," Thomas said. "I was just existing before you. Working, surviving, but not really living. You taught me what it meant to live fully, to love completely, to give everything for something that matters." They stood in silence, watching the sun set one more time over the land they'd built their life on. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep purple, and stars began to emerge in the darkening blue. "When I'm gone," Thomas started, but Jane pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight we're both here, both alive, both together. That's enough." "When I'm gone," Thomas insisted gently, moving her hand to hold it instead, "I want you to know that every day with you was a gift. Every morning I woke up beside you, every evening we sat on this porch, every moment we breathed together, all of it was precious. You are the love of my life, Jane Xavier. You always will be." "And you are mine," Jane said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My heart, my home, my reason for being brave. I was so scared that day in the stagecoach. But you held my hand and told me to breathe, and I've been breathing easier ever since." They walked back to the house slowly, holding each other up. Two people who had become so intertwined over 3 decades that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. They ate a simple dinner, shared memories, laughed over old jokes, and finally settled into bed together as they had every night for 30 years. "Breathe with me," Thomas whispered, as he always did. "Always," Jane replied, as she always did. And in the darkness of their bedroom, in the house they'd built with their own hands, Thomas and Jane Xavier breathed together one more time, their hearts beating in perfect synchronization, their lives completely and irrevocably joined. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, his hand held firmly in Jane's. She had woken in the night to find him still and quiet beside her, his face peaceful, the faint smile he always wore when he looked at her still gracing his lips. And though grief threatened to overwhelm her, though she wanted to shake and fall apart the way she had that day in the stagecoach, Jane took a deep breath instead. In and out, the way Thomas had taught her. She held his hand until the children came, and she was steady, the way he would have wanted her to be. Jane lived another 7 years after Thomas died. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with teaching and writing and gardening. She never remarried, never even considered it. She had found her great love, and one was enough for a lifetime. She spent her final years writing down their story, wanting future generations to understand what their grandparents had built, what they had risked, what they had sacrificed for love. She wrote about fear and courage, about the importance of choosing your own path, even when the world tells you there's only one way forward. "Your grandfather taught me to breathe," she wrote in the final pages of her memoir. "But more than that, he taught me to live. He taught me that I was worth saving, worth fighting for, worth loving. And in turn, I learned to save myself, to fight for what I believed in, to love without reservation. That's what I hope you all remember. Not just that we loved each other, though we did with a fierceness that sustained us through everything, but that we chose that love every day, over and over again. We chose courage over fear, hope over despair, each other over everything else, and it made all the difference." Jane died in her sleep in 1921, in the blue house she and Thomas had built together, surrounded by the family they had created. Her last words, whispered to young Thomas who sat beside her holding her hand, were simply, "Tell them about the breathing. Tell them how he held my hand and said, 'Breathe with me,' and how everything changed in that moment. Tell them that love is worth being brave for." Young Thomas did tell them. He told his children, who told their children, who told theirs. The story became legend in Jerome Junction, the tale of the mail-order bride who couldn't stop shaking and the cowboy who taught her to breathe. Couples would visit the Blue House, now a historical landmark, and stand on the porch where Thomas and Jane had spent so many evenings. They would hold hands and promise each other to be brave, to choose love, to breathe together through whatever life brought them. The Xavier Ranch stayed in the family for generations, each one adding to the legacy that Thomas and Jane had started. The land prospered, the family grew, and the story continued. Young Thomas's son, also named Thomas, became a doctor and spoke often about his great-grandparents, about the importance of mental health and treating panic with patience rather than judgment. He credited his career choice to the story of his great-grandmother's shaking and his great-grandfather's compassionate response. Margaret Xavier, daughter of the original twins, became a prominent suffragette, fighting for women's rights and citing her grandmother's story as proof that women deserved agency over their own lives. The right to leave dangerous situations, the freedom to choose their own paths. David's writings about his parents were collected and published, becoming a bestseller that brought the story of Thomas and Jane to people far beyond Arizona. Letters poured in from women who had been in similar situations, who had found the courage to leave because of Jane's example. From men who had learned that true strength meant gentleness, that real courage meant caring for those who were frightened. The stagecoach that had brought Jane to Jerome Junction that fateful day was preserved in the town's historical society, along with Jane's journal, and the letter Patrick Sullivan had written to Thomas. Visitors would stand before these artifacts and try to imagine that moment when everything changed, when a frightened woman met a compassionate man, and both their lives were transformed. On the grave marker in Jerome Junction Cemetery, where Thomas and Jane Xavier were buried side by side under an old cottonwood tree, a simple inscription was carved. Together they breathed, together they lived, together they loved, together always. And on certain quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right through the town, old-timers swore they could still hear it. The gentle rhythm of two people breathing in perfect synchronization, a cowboy and his bride finding peace in each other's presence for all eternity. The story of the stagecoach that brought a bride who couldn't stop shaking, and the cowboy who held her hand and said, "Breathe with me," became more than just a tale of romance. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of courage, and the transformative nature of love freely chosen. It reminded generations that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out when you're scared, hold on when everything tells you to let go, and breathe through the fear until you find your way to the other side. And in Jerome Junction, Arizona, in a small blue house on the edge of town, in the hearts of the family that still gathered there every year, the love between Thomas Xavier and Jane Wilson Xavier lived on, as fresh and real as the day it began, proof that some loves are strong enough to echo through the ages, brave enough to change the world, and true enough to last forever.